Hey, welcome everybody. This is the 1000th episode of the Confluence Outfitters. I don't know what one we're on, but this is the Confluence Outfitters podcast. I'm Andrew Harris. We have Randy Hamann and Luke Geraty here with me today, and we are going to talk about TroutSpey, primarily about TroutSpey on the Lower Sacramento River. And that's why we have Randy here with us today, because he's a big practitioner of TroutSpey. He's way into it. He's a great TroutSpey instructor. We have numerous TroutSpey guides on staff. Randy's one of them, and we're hoping to learn a lot from him today about what it is, why would you do it, when and where, all that good stuff.
Yeah, everything. So I mean,
basically everything.
We can start with we can start with what is TroutSpey?
Well, TroutSpey is fishing for trout on the swing on a river with a two-handed rod. It's basically derived from the original Spey casting from the UK, the River Spey, and we've taken that, we've changed it into a few variations here in the United States, and one of them has become TroutSpey, where we're using a two-handed rod, using mostly sustained anchor casts to throw one or two flies out in the river and swing them through a given run and hopefully connect with the fish.
So, yeah, because I think the first Spey rod I ever held was like a 14-foot, and it was like for salmon.
Weight.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I had a hard time imagining trout. I mean, I don't.
Right. Well, and hard to imagine steelhead on that now.
Yeah.
Because I was the same way. The first rod I had for steelhead was a 14-foot 9-weight.
Yeah.
And I would never even consider fishing that.
Yeah. So the TroutSpey game has progressed to the point where it's very focused on trout.
It has. It has evolved. And typically, the tackle TroutSpey rod is 10 and a half to up to like 12 feet in length, and 3 to say 5 weight. On the Lower Sac, I tend to favor a little heavier. I know they do make 2-weight TroutSpeys, but I think they're kind of a niche into little fish in smaller waters or maybe stuff in the Rockies. But the Lower Sac in particular is a big river.
Yeah.
Even at low flows, it's 4,500 CFS. It's a good sized piece of water. So I think a bigger rod helps cover the water better. And then you're also dealing with wind, helps deal with the wind a bit better. So I would say an all around size weight would be a 4 or 5 weight for the Lower Sac, and probably 11 foot to 12 and a half foot rod in that weight grade window.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So the TroutSpey rods are scaled back a bit from the traditional salmon and steelhead rods.
They are scaled back to make, basically playing the quarry, i.e. trout, more entertaining and enjoyable.
Okay.
To get a bigger bend in the rod, as well as less likely to break tippets, because we're typically trying to gear everything down in size and fish in lighter tippets and smaller flies. And so everything just is taking the Northwest steelhead Spey and downsizing it.
Okay.
And refining it a little bit.
Yeah.
And so, Randy, you can swing a fly on a regular single-hand rod.
Absolutely.
So why do the TroutSpey?
The TroutSpey, I think the two biggest reasons I went into TroutSpey versus single-handed, because I grew up throwing a single-handed rod and swinging for trout and steelhead with a single-handed rod, was two things. One, dealing with my surroundings, i.e. my back cast, not having to deal with a back cast. If you're making a 30-foot cast out into the river, or 35-foot cast, or if you're trying to shoot line, even if you're trying to make a 50 or 60-foot cast with a single-handed rod, you still got 30 feet of line in there that you're going to ultimately shoot that additional line out. You need that room behind you to make a back cast, whether there's a rocky bank behind you or brush behind you, limits the pieces of water you might be able to fish or cover effectively. So with a two-handed rod or Spey rod, you can minimize your back cast to almost zero. So you can be up against the wall, as they say, be right up against a bank and be able to project line out into the current and get a nice swing. The other is the ease on the body. It's not as physical. It's easier to cast the equivalent line weight with 2 hands versus 1 hand. And so ultimately throughout the day, I find it a lot easier physically. You don't end up with, a sore shoulder or sore bicep, sore elbow from whipping that, whatever it is, 6, 7 weight, single-handed rod with a shooting head type taper on it or something like that all day long. So
yeah, you had said also too, as far as covering water, so you're able to cover more water, because I think like when you're single handing, you're having to do 850 back casts.
Yeah.
Whereas with the TroutSpey, you just, I was watching
the transition from stripping your flies in, getting ready to the cast, to actually putting your flies back out to where they're fishing again is cut in half, maybe even less.
Yeah.
To where your flies are spending a lot more time in the river than they are aerialized.
Yeah, and I've heard, Andrew told me once, that if your fly's in the water, you're more likely to catch fish.
This is true. He's smart that way, but yeah.
Been around.
I wrote it down.
Good.
Yeah, those are words to live by.
Yeah.
Flies need to be in the water to catch a fish.
Yeah.
On the Lower Sac, with it being a larger, pretty big trout stream, when you are doing your TroutSpey, what's the typical, once you're proficient at it and you're in a big piece of water, like how far is a typical TroutSpey cast?
It depends on where I think the fish lie. Today we were out and fished a few different places. The last place we fished, I know the fish kind of hang tight to the bank, so we weren't fishing much beyond the head of our line. We weren't shooting much running line, so our casts were probably in that 35, 40 foot range. And you can catch fish, whether it be here on the Lower Sac or steelheading on any given river. You can definitely catch fish on a 30-foot cast. It's just the water type that you're in. But on the Lower Sac, I would say your casts are going to range anywhere from 30 feet to, you don't need to cast much more than 60 feet. I can never really see you casting, needing to cast. I mean, if you want to, it's fun.
Yeah.
But the necessity to cast that far.
So the advantage to TroutSpey is being able to cast further, easier.
To cast further easier is a big thing.
And covering that water. So, you talked about the rods being anywhere from like 10.5 to 12.
Yes.
What kind of reels are you generally using? And then what is that? What's that thick stuff that's on that reel that is, going out
The string?
Yeah,
the string.
The string. Well, most there are a lot of lines, and we can get into the weeds on it. But breaking it down to the most basic is a modified version of what we used to use for single-handed casting, and some people still do, is a shooting head system where you've got hooked to your arbor on your reel, you've got backing. That backing is attached to then a shooting line, or sometimes called a running line. Then that running line is attached to a shooting head. That is where the weight is. That's the equivalent of your split shot or your lead on it.
Yeah, and that's the heavier.
That's the heavier part, and it tends to be thicker. And it varies as far as how much taper there is to it, depending upon the type of Skagit or type of Scandi head it is. Then from that, it goes to a tip. And that tip might float, that tip might slowly sink, that tip might sink really fast. And then on that tip, you transition to your actual leader that your flies are tied to.
Okay. So, and then does the reel matter?
The reel matters mostly in size, the capacity. So any good trout reel will work for most spey casting for TroutSpey. It's just, you need a larger one. So like a 4-weight TroutSpey rod, you typically would probably have more like a 7 or 8 weight trout reel on there.
Okay.
Or
Gotcha.
A 7 or 8 weight reel.
Just to kind of balance out everything and then have capacity.
But capacity for what you're talking about, the thicker line.
Yeah.
Once you go to reel all that in and spool it up, you need capacity to hold that.
Okay.
So even though it's technically called a 4-weight, the line thickness adds up really quick on the spool. So you need a larger diameter spool.
Yeah, and so you talked about the weeds, so I know that there's like different types of line systems for different types of spey stuff.
Right.
Is the So does it matter? Like, can you just go out and buy any Skagit or Scandi line, or does it all match the rods? How would somebody?
It does match the rods, and that is kind of the one tricky thing. It is good to either go out with a guide and fish some of his gear and see how you like the way it's balanced, whether you feel comfortable with it or not, and then maybe start shopping on that, or go to a shop that has sales staff that can help you with that, because the line does matter as far as a given weight. Say a 4-weight rod, you can go and get a 4-weight Skagit head to fit that, but that 4-weight rod is going to have what's called a window to it. It'll handle a wider range than just that one specific line you may pick up, and you might favor one line more than another. It's not unlike any other sport, golf or whatever. You don't golf with one club, you know. There are, and you might find you have several of these lines. The good thing is they're not terribly expensive, and that's the beauty of that system. Is if one of the shooting heads is, you feel it's too light, you want a little more load, or you feel it's overloading your rod and it's too heavy, you can go and buy just that section, and swap that section out.
Yeah. You had talked about part of it being for the type of tips you're using. So I remember when I first started trying to figure out this stuff, I had I could not turn over this big rabbit strip fly. It just wouldn't. And then a friend who does a lot of Spey was like, I think I was like 150 grains way too small. It was like, and it just would flop. So, he recommended a line, and I got it, and all of a sudden it was able to turn over that tip and the big rabbit strip.
Yeah. So in most of the TroutSpeys, again, we're talking about everything's downsized, so you can't expect it to turn over really big flies, because that's not what it's designed for. So they, you do have limitations, and you're not necessarily throwing huge flies for trout anyways. But again, you can always get a balanced set from one of the manufacturers, or oftentimes even on the online sales companies will have a balanced outfit. And not to say that's going to be something that you're going to be set with for the rest of your life, but it's a good place to start, or like going to a good fly shop.
And most of the TroutSpey rods now generally have a recommended. They have it.
They have a recommended grain window, and so like say a 4-weight might have a grain window of 300 to 400 grains for a Skagit line, and typically they'll have 2 grain weight windows. One is for Scandi and one is for Skagit, and the difference is the length of that head and the taper of that head. So that's what I was backing up. That's what I was alluding to earlier was, a given rod might say the grain window for that rod is a 300 to 400 grain Skagit. One guy might like it with a 300 grain Skagit on it. The other guy likes it with a 400 grain Skagit. I usually generally start with somewhere in the middle of that grain window. Not all manufacturers do that, but most of them do, and it's printed right on the rod.
Okay. Yeah. So we've got rods, we got reels, we got lines, but you mentioned a little about flies. I mean, what's TroutSpey? What kind of flies are you?
I think it varies all over the country, but here on the Lower Sac, a lot of it stems from nymphing and indicator fishing, because these fish are they're trout. They're trouty.
They're bug eccentric.
They're bug eccentric. Yeah. They know what they like to eat. So a lot of it is fishing flies that we feel confident about if we have them under an indicator, or if we're tight lining nymphs under. And most of the time, these fish are they don't show themselves. They're usually down in the water column, so we're fishing usually fairly deep. There are times when they're up in the shallows and we can get them near the surface, but most of the time it's deeper, and they're often trout patterns, nymph patterns. I mean, the classic here is a bird's nest, beadhead bird's nest. Size 12 for 12 to 14 bird's nests are really popular. The natural colors are the olive colors, woolly bugger type patterns. And then like summer steelhead type patterns, the more buggy looking ones, not so much greenbutt skunks, but ones that maybe more emulate like a golden stone or a stonefly,
like that burlap or something like
burlap, some of the herniators, assassins, beaded assassins, herniators, burlaps, things that are a little buggier.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then again, kind of taking from the trout side, the single-handed trout side is, if one becomes competent and they can cast a fairly decent efficiency level, we'll often tie 2 flies on. We'll have a, point fly, a bigger fly, and then a trailer with a smaller nymph. Maybe something that's, 14, maybe even as small as 16 if the water's soft and we've got a nice clarity to the water and we know the fish are going to key on those flies.
Okay.
So here on the Lower Sac, a lot of it is geared towards nymphing, but we're presenting those flies in a swinging manner versus dead drifting them, and they will eat them that way.
Yeah.
The other patterns are, I have a lot of confidence in little leeches, small leeches, derived from what they call a semi-seal leech. Basically, they were originally tied to like seal fur, but now we've got all the synthetics. But little leeches are a big thing with me.
And do you just still just let those swing, or do you impart any action to those?
I mix it up. So, I mean, initially I'll go through a run, quartering across or quartering down and letting that fly swing under tension, just nice and quiet. And if I've fished a run and I'm fairly confident there's fish in there and I'm not getting a reaction, I will start twitching it or jigging it. Or once it comes under tension, let it dead drift or swing for a little bit. Gets halfway through the swing, I'll start stripping it in. And the strips I like are like woolly booger strips, just little inconsistent 2 to 3 to 4 inch strips. Stop, pause, and just play with that until you find a pattern that they might like, and then try to stick with that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, but part of wouldn't it be accurate to? I mean, like with the caddis stuff. I mean, there are. We did a TroutSpey trip last year. Remember, the caddis were everywhere, and it was like they were eating on the surface. So I think you started tight lining with your Spey rod. I feel like
I don't remember.
There may be video evidence.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, I've found when it's like that, when there are a lot of caddis, those caddis are coming off in those shallows and those shallow riffles. Not far from the bank. That goes back to that 30-foot cast, and then we'll switch to like what's called an intermediate tip. It's a very slow sink tip. They're typically clear in color. Leader on that, and that's when like that bird's nest comes, in handy. And we're fishing those flies when they're swinging across. They're very near the surface. They're in the surface film or down maybe 2 or 3 inches tops. They're not really penetrating very much, and those fish are looking up for those caddis coming up off the bottom. So that's,
it seems like there is a natural aspect to it too.
Oh, absolutely. And there is some aspect where those caddis naturally will almost, we're imitating something that they do. They will come off the bottom, and they're kind of swinging as they're trying to make their way towards the surface, and we can represent that pretty well with the swung fly.
Yeah, that's what about, so you're primarily on the Lower Sac using bug imitations and some leeches.
Leeches, and the leeches might also kind of segue over into, bait fish, because, they are trout and they will.
Well, that's what I was curious. Will you use streamers, muddlers?
Mudlers, and the thing about a muddler is it could be imitating a bait fish, it could be a sculpin, it could be,
a
stonefly, a grasshopper, a stonefly trying to work its way towards the shore, or a salmon fly. I mean,
we saw it today, and we saw a couple of stoneflies that were, they were big.
They were big.
I could totally see a sculpin pattern being mistaken for that.
Oh, yeah, and I've seen here the Pteronarcis californica, I believe they're called, which the salmon flies are, those nymphs are 3 inches long and big and black and ugly looking. They exist in this river. So the muddler is a great one. And that can be fish under a heavy sink tip in deep water, or that could, if those fish are in the shallow water, that's again a pattern that could be fish near the surface film and waiting for that opportunistic fish to be looking up and snag it off the top.
Yeah. So those are that's your kind of your fly selection for the most part.
Yeah, for the most part. There are some great streamers, and I want to eat them, but I don't have a lot of confidence fishing them here. I think there are rivers in the Sierras that I would, but for some reason
the Lower Sac's weird about
Lower Sac's weird about bait fish. But
my explanation is always I think our trout are very lazy. They just don't seem as willing to go chase after a big honking.
And they're all rainbows, and I think they're just not as
They're not brown
keen to
Good point.
eat a big meal.
The East Walker and throwing a streamer across the bank is, up against the bank, that's money. But here they're just like, whatever.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a good explanation of what TroutSpey is, the gear. If somebody wants to get into TroutSpey, because I have talked to numerous people actually in my boat who have kind of asked about, hey, what's up with the Spey thing, So let's say somebody out there is like, I really want to. What do they do? What's the best way to get into TroutSpey?
I think the best way to get into TroutSpey is hiring a guide, or if you have a knowledgeable buddy that can get you started on the right path. I don't think it necessarily should be judged by how much prior experience you have fishing at all. I think you could come on a TroutSpey trip here being a total newbie to fishing in general.
Okay.
I would,
So you don't have to master single-handed.
You don't have to
first.
master. It's not a prerequisite. No, you don't have to master single-handed casting before you start Spey casting.
That's good to know because I haven't yet, so there is hope for me. That's just wonderful.
Oftentimes I've had clients that have never cast a fly rod before, and they start with Spey, and sometimes those are the easiest people to get started because we're not trying to break any bad habits that they may have already developed with a single-handed rod.
Oh, that's great.
And there's a lot of things that happen with a single-handed rod that the general public thinks, well, that just basically traverses right into Spey casting, but it doesn't. And some of those ingrained habits that you have with a single-handed rod that you think should work with a Spey rod don't.
Yeah. Okay.
I think if you want to get started in it, go out with somebody that's got experience, whether it be a guide or a good buddy that has experience with it. But I don't think any prior experience should hold you back.
So there's no checklist of like, okay, I got to do 10 trips on.
I think just the general desire would be the biggest.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think one of the benefits too of the guide or the buddy would be having the right gear to get you started right away. Because I know a lot of people will go out fly fishing, with the wrong gear the first time, so they don't know how to cast very well, or I think that's probably a huge benefit.
Yeah, and you might not necessarily know if if you don't know, you don't know. So if you've got a buddy that's got a good setup, or if you go out with a guy that's got a balanced setup, and you're starting with the right gear, then you know what it should feel like right from the beginning.
Well, like I think today and yesterday you had 3 Spey rods in your boat.
Always.
And it was like, hey, there's one of every.
Yeah, and often they're different weights, but oftentimes they're just rigged up with different sink rates on the tips, and that might also go back to the shooting head on it. I want a heavier head to turn over a heavier sink tip, and then if I'm fishing a lighter tip, then I can get by with a lighter sink head and maybe even a lighter rod. And that also would then hold true to the flies. But again, you don't need to go out and buy 3 rods to get started. One rod.
That's good to know.
Most people have this, once they read up about it, they think it's a 3-weight or a 4-weight game. I think on the Lower Sac, it's a 5-weight game too. It's a big river. So, and if you buy a 5-weight Spey rod, that rod will also work on the Trinity. If you wanted to go there, it would work on the Lower Klamath or the Upper Klamath.
Really versatile rod.
It's a versatile rod. Yeah. It's a little bit light for steelhead, but you can do it. It'll pull it off.
Well, I think let's talk about the fish for a minute, actually, because we talked about what TroutSpey is, the gear, but I think there is something to be said about, because we're on the Sac all the time, right? We take for granted. There are big fish on the Lower Sac.
There are big fish on. So that
it's not a like a high mountain stream with these little brookies.
No, not the palm-sized little brookies that are beautiful to look at. No, so if you come out here armed with that 3-weight Spey and you happen to hook into a 23-inch or 4-inch or 8-inch rainbow, your chances of landing that fish are probably you've gone to a gunfight with a knife.
Yeah, because I think the majority of our fish are wild rainbows.
All of them.
There's a hatchery steelhead too.
There is a hatchery steelhead, but as far as the trout go, they're all wild.
So that's what I was going to say. The addition, like we have wild rainbows that are very feisty, very strong, and then you might hook into a hatchery steelhead in the fall or the spring, and it might.
Or you might hook into a wild steelhead.
Yeah.
In the
that's
fall.
true too. Yeah, that's true too. Yeah.
Yeah, there are plenty of tributaries on the Lower Sac below Redding that sustain a wild steelhead fishery. Yeah. It's not known like the Trinity or Klamath, but there are. Historically, it was probably one of the best steelhead rivers in the world. But they're still there.
Yeah. And I mean, every year, we you hook a lot of trout. I think depending on where you're at, right? There's the cookie cutter 16-inch rainbows, but there's a lot of 18, there's a lot of 20, there's a lot of 22s, and then there's some decent amount of big fish too. So to me, one of the big selling points about the Lower Sac is always, for me, it's like I like big fish, and the Lower Sac has a lot of big fish in it.
Absolutely.
So I know it's not for everybody, but for some people, I mean. I've had people, and you guys all have too, who they've caught the largest trout they've ever caught in their life was on the Lower Sac.
An hour or two from home.
It's like
they've traveled the world. And they drive 2.5, 3 hours from home and catch the biggest fish.
We did an episode. Colin and I did an episode on the podcast about the Rockies versus NorCal, and there was some controversy because he and I both. We both were just saying how I love Montana, I love Colorado too. It's amazing, but it's hard to beat, the 20-minute away from our house where we're catching these monstrous rainbows. So the fish, what could, so the TroutSpey game is not like, I guess the main thing is that's not like some secret code you have to get into and you have to know.
Don't need a secret handshake. No secret handshakes, no. I mean, it does help, but you don't need that.
It does help.
So are you saying it's DIY friendly? Is that kind of like,
where
are you going?
I mean, more so it's like for somebody who's never done it. I mean, this is something that, because I think I always felt like, that's like that's for the super good anglers, and it was like,
I can do it.
No, it's
don't
not.
Sell yourself short,
It's not for the super duper good anglers. So that's what I was alluding to earlier. Is anybody could get started in it. Whether you've got a long history of fly fishing, a long history of angling in general, or you've never fished before in your life, but you saw this in a magazine or a video, and that's that interest here piqued your interest. Come on out. You don't need to start from the base level and work your way up. You can start with this, right?
I guess that's kind of what I mean. I think there's a lot of people out there that they see a progression in fly fishing to where it's like, this is number 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's the Spey World.
I think that is because a lot of people, myself included, have gone that route, but it's not necessarily a path that you have to take. I mean, that has been my path.
Most people, I think.
You equate it to being a big game hunter, where you've gone out and you've bagged, however many deer, and you're like, oh, I'm over that with a 30-06 and a scope. I'm going to pick up a bow. And, so that's what I equate it to, is like, the Spey rod. You're changing the way you're fishing. You're not gonna boat 50 fish in a day Spey casting on the Lower Sac. It's just not gonna happen.
Speak for yourself. I don't.
It's not gonna happen. But it's a matter of how you're doing it, and it's the way that you choose to do it.
Well, and what is it about TroutSpey that people do or might find appealing? I mean, what's the draw?
The draw for me is, I think, not to get too, woodsy about it, but just being a little more in tune with your surroundings. If you're doing a typical indicator side drift and trip with a guide or with a buddy that has a boat and can row on Lower Sac, your day consists of making water load casts or roll casts and staring at an indicator. And as soon as you take your eye off that indicator,
well, it goes under.
It goes under.
I was just saying, most of my clients are looking around and missing.
Right. I don't know what you're talking about. And the guide's barking at them, hey. Yeah. So you can hook a fish on the swing without looking at your line. And you could be admiring the osprey or the bald eagle.
Right.
We saw some great bald eagles in the last few days. I mean, they're out in force right now. But that is, and just to go back, this is fishing while waiting.
Right.
We're not fishing from a boat. We're using a boat as transportation. We're waiting. So there's a difference between fishing in a boat, drifting, side drifting, and out waiting in the current.
Big time.
That's
Getting your feet wet.
Getting your feet wet. You
thing.
just feel a little more in tune to your surroundings. You tend to, I think, pay attention a little more to what's going on. Again, if you're staring at an indicator, you didn't see that fish boil, 40 or 50 feet below you. You don't know to work to him because you didn't see him.
Yeah, there's certain things about the Spey experience that are just, probably a lot, I don't know, bigger, broader. It's more beautiful in some ways too. But can I just say that the grab is for, I like your eagles and everything. That's cool. But that grab is.
Yeah, that's it. It's not a matter of watching an indicator or something else to see when a fish is interested in your fly. The fish will let you know that it's interested because they typically pick it up. What happens is they'll pick it up and they naturally turn. So when they make that turn motion, you get yanked.
Yeah.
And going back to the size of rods, if your game is thinking about the lower sac, I would tend towards a 4 or 5 weight versus the 3 weight, just because of playing to larger fish. If you get a 14 to 16 inch trout in a decent current here on this river, it's going to have its way with you. On a 3 weight Spey.
Yeah.
That's, it's similar to a 4 or 5 weight, single handed rod, and you can land that fish, but
it's not great for the fish.
It's not great for the fish. Good chance you're just, you're going to spend too much time playing that fish. Good chance you're going to spend so much time playing that fish that it's going to spit the hook. So I would tend to lean more towards the 4 or 5 weight rod. But yes, the grab, the initial take is 99% of the time how you're in the game and that you got a fish on. It's highly unusual when your line is under tension for a fish to ever show interest in your fly and you not feel it.
Yeah.
You know it's happening.
Yeah.
There might be times when you initially cast and your fly's dead drifting and some fish might come randomly and grab it, but you'll never know that. But once that fly is under tension, under swing, you're going to know.
Yeah. There's no question.
And you feel that electricity running right up that line, right through your line,
awesome.
right up to your arm, right into your heart.
I think today I was like, like a giddy little kid,
Yeah.
So, okay, we were talking kind of about how there's for some people there's a progression.
Yeah.
So somebody gets into TroutSpey, is it a gateway to other, can you take that technique, I guess, and go do other things?
Yeah, well, obviously you could take that technique to pretty much any moving piece of water, I think.
Okay.
And then again, your tackle would probably change depending upon where you fish. Like I said, if you're fishing, Rocky Mountain streams or, smaller Sierra streams, then you're the Owens, let's say the Owens, something like that. You're gonna maybe want that 3 weight. But the gateway, and it's been reversed for me as I was steelheader. So I took up TroutSpey as a way to continue my steelhead angling basically vicariously. I'm still on a river. I'm still fishing for a rainbow. It's just not a sea run rainbow necessarily. And I can do it with a 2-handed rod and continue my Spey game 365 days a year. It's not just limited to the September, October through, February, March. And then I'm like, oh God, I'm waiting until September again to go steelhead fishing to pick up my 2-handed
You're
rod.
able to do it.
I'm able to do it year round. So, the gateway would be if you started with TroutSpey, then I think steelhead would be the next, on the West Coast would be the next thing, or if you lived in the Great Lakes. But I'd imagine, I don't know, there's probably places where you could fish, stripers on certain rivers with the Spey rod. I don't see why not.
Shad,
definitely.
Shad.
I know American River, a lot of Spey people.
Yeah, so we got the Yuba in this area. We got the Yuba. We've got the main stem, the lower sac, and the feather and the American all have shad runs.
Yeah. And what's the Mongolian, that big old
the
Taman.
Yeah, I know a lot of people are doing Spey.
Oh yeah,
Taman.
Yeah.
Well, and then the classic would be then going back to the Atlantic salmon and fishing, Northern Europe or Iceland or one of those places, So that spay technique that you might learn with the trout spay, some of the mechanics will change. Physics, I guess, not so much mechanics, but physics will change as you get into those larger species because you're going to need larger tackle. But the fundamental casts that you learn will all transfer over to those other quarries. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that's kind of good to know, though. That you could have other species or other opportunities.
Oh yeah, I think there are people all over this country and probably the world trying to figure out what they can catch on a spay rod. I mean, once what I found is the people that I have either taught or buddies of mine that have got into it, people I've associated with. Once you get that under your skin and it's something you enjoy, you're always trying to think how you can implement it in other ways. It just becomes somewhat a preferred way to fish. And not to sound like a snob or be snobby about it, because again, speaking just of this fishery on the Lower Sac, I kind of almost think of it as a jet boat day on the Lower Sac, and we could spay cast that whole time. But if we want to, we can also fish other ways. We would weight fish, i.e. fishing a single-handed rod, the dry fly, or tight line nymphing. So I often have some single-handed rods with me on that boat, to make a day of it. And that also can break it up too, especially if a spangler's got some single-handed experience and they're just learning trout spay and they might get frustrated. We can put that spay rod down and we can go grab a single-handed rod and go spend some time with that and then come back to the spay. And so here on the Lower Sac, we've got that kind of versatility. And again, speaking just of the Lower Sac, just so people don't get the wrong idea about spay here, if you come up here to learn spay and you don't have a buddy with a boat or you don't hire a guide, you're really limited. The access on the Lower Sac.
It'd be really tough to do.
It's very tough to do. There's very few walk-in places to where you have the right type of water that you want to swim over.
And also too, just being attuned to the flows, the changes, knowing where you can. I mean, we kind of spent the last 2 days exploring a bit and checking out water to see, hey, can we swing?
We're under some high water conditions. We've had two, back-to-back heavy winters, so that water's got to go somewhere, and it's all going out to sea right now through the Lower Sac.
Going right through Red Bluff.
You're going right through Red Bluff,
okay, so that's kind of cool to know, though. So, I mean, talk a little more about, you're talking about jet boat trips. So, like my trips are a drift boat generally. What does a jet boat spay trip kind of feel like? I mean, do you meet at 3 a.m. after?
No. Well, the Lower Sac, there's generally no need to meet at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Okay. That's good to know.
It's
Why'd you make me meet you at 3 this morning?
Well, somebody had to make the donuts.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a gentleman's fishery as far as that goes. It always seems to be, that 9 o'clock to maybe 2 o'clock window, and even refining that 11 to 2 when things are hot. Again, it can transpire into the evening where you can get some really good fishing in the evening. Rarely is it really good first light.
There's no reason.
There's no reason. So a jet boat trip on the Lower Sac, typically for clients, is I either meet them at their motel and pick them up and take them to the ramp, or we meet at the ramp. And i.e. one ramp, because we have a jet boat, we can go upriver, we can go downriver, and we end up at the same place. So there's no need to run a shuttle.
Wow. That must be nice.
Nobody has to pay for. Nobody needs to run a shuttle. We don't need to pay for a shuttle, or we don't need to take an hour out of our trip. Day spent on the river driving vehicles up and down I-5 for bumpy Balls Ferry Road. We meet in the morning, usually around 8:30, and finish up between 4 or 5 o'clock, and just spend the day moving up and down the river. And my program typically is trying to find water that's a little less fished, a little less traveled. There may be fewer fish in that given area. That's why there's not as many boats there. But I always feel that there's less pressure. You're more apt to be able to hook those fish than fishing over 500 fish that have 300 boats over them.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, duly noted. Okay. So that's kind of, and then throughout the day, you're mentioning the different techniques. I mean, are you looking for rising fish? Or
Yeah. So, if it's a day that's, most of them are spay oriented, we're going to start out spay fishing, and we're going to work that for a while. And typically the dries won't start coming off. We won't start seeing risers till late in the morning or early afternoon, and then again later in the evening. But yeah, if I start seeing, my guys are out there swinging away, and I happen to see some slack water down below us, and there's fish consistently rising there, I will make that suggestion. If they want to continue to swing, let's continue to swing. But if they want to cut bait, reel up, and grab a dry fly rod, we'll go down there and try that, chase the heads. Yeah.
So I mean, are you just out of curiosity, how many spots are you swinging? Does that kind of depend on how long
it depends a lot upon how long the run is. And some of these runs are very long, where we can easily spend, an hour plus. I would say that on an average, we'll probably hit 6 spots a day.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a lot of water.
Yeah, 6 different spots a day. Yeah. And some of them, we might pull into and spend, 20, 30 minutes there. And if I'm not feeling it, hey, we're getting in the boat. Let's go check out another. And if we find a spot and we're getting into fish, we're going to make laps through there. Going back a little bit to the spay casting and spay fishing, it's a traditional cast, step, and swing type fishery, to where we're wading down a run. We're starting at the top of the run typically, and then working our way down. And if we pick up fish intermittently, there's no reason why we can't go back up to the top of that run and start over, and pick up their buddies that didn't see our flag the first time through.
Yeah. Okay.
So sometimes, if it's, conducive, we might spend, 2 or 3 hours in one spot, if the fish are there. But if the fish aren't there, let's get in the boat and motor. That sounds
great. So when I start my spade trip guiding, I now know all the details. Thank you. So, no.
You're welcome.
Yeah. I'm sure he's really threatened.
Yeah. Good point.
How about the wading? What kind of boots do you recommend people bring? Waders, wet wading? How does that all go?
Wet wading is an option. I think it's limited. I think the wet wading is limited to those really ripping hot days in the summertime. The thing about the Lower Sac that makes it such a great trout fishery is the water's cold. It's typically 50 to 55 degrees. Sometimes it might get into the upper 50s, but it seems like it's always somewhere in the 50s.
It's cold.
It's cold.
Yeah.
So if you're wading into your knees, your ankles start to ache after a while if you're wet wading. I mean, if you're at a spot where it's ripping hot and you just got your feet wet, then wet wading's a fine way to go. And you might dip yourself
for like 10 minutes.
Yeah, I was just say, I feel like every time I do it, about 25 minutes into it, I'm like, that was stupid.
Yeah.
I brought the
now I'm all wet. Now I can't put my weight.
Yeah. So
right.
I almost never wet wade. I do on occasion, but I would say it's rare.
Yeah.
I think a good Gore-Tex wader, breathable, is key. The wading, it's a broad river. It's not particularly fast, and there's not large boulders, but the boulders are snotty often. They're slimy.
So felt soles.
I highly recommend felts, and I highly recommend felts with studs. I don't, studs are welcome in my boat. I'd rather have my boat floor marred up than you spending your time bailing out your waders.
Yeah.
So I'm always, if I have a brand new pair of felts, I feel comfortable. But after 2 or 3 days of wearing those felts and running around in moss and mud, the studs are going in.
Yeah. I gotcha.
I've got studs.
Yeah, and also I think you have a pair of the pant waders.
Yeah, I love the pant waders for the TroutSpey.
That was a game changer.
Yeah,
it's like man. Because today we were it was 80.
Yeah,
today.
I was going to mention that I do have a pair of pant waders, and then the other thing is I know Patagonia and I think Sims now, they do offer convertibles where you can roll them down. But the pant wading, because typically we're not wading that deep.
Right.
Rarely are we wading crotch deep. It's mostly knee calf deep to knee deep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, because I mean that's the kind of the weird thing about our fishery is that it it can be really hot outside of the water, but the water's really cold.
Yeah.
So it's like you're always kind of like, yeah. So those pant waders are, man, could not recommend them enough.
Sun protection, long sleeve shirts typically, unless you're really thick skinned. Hats, lots of sunscreen, buffs. Live by a
Polaroids,
especially
for Spey. Can we? Right?
Well, glasses. You gotta have eye
for safety.
Eye
I see
protection.
Yeah,
eye protection always. I never. If the light is so bad that I can't make a cast without glasses on, I reel up and go home. Yeah. That's time to call it quits.
That's a good. I think that's a good rule to live by.
But yeah, glasses always.
What SPF do you go with?
70 typically.
So I think Luke will pitch in to get you something more than like 2 SPF.
I'm a 25 or
2.5 SPF. Is that what you use today?
I don't put suntan lotion on. I just
7.
I'm young, man.
Well,
for a while.
Get you some 50.
Normally, here's the main problem. You see that?
That's
I'm just letting people know I'm out there.
That's a good look. Yeah, that'll be fun when that peels. Yeah.
My wife's always making fun of it.
Raccoon eyes from skiing is one thing. That's a little different.
it was hot today. Or I mean, it was sunny.
It was sunny today and it was breezy. But 70 SPF, whatever you can plaster on, and then cover up. Buffs are great.
I think that's answers all the basic questions about TroutSpey.
Super fun way to fish.
I think maybe final question before we get out of here is time of year. What's if somebody wants to do a TroutSpey trip on the Lower Sac? That's primarily what we're talking about. When are the peak? When can we do it?
It can be done, and every guide will tell you this about every venue. It can be done 365 days a year, but definitely there are better times than others. I would say the thing about the Lower Sac is because it is, unfortunately, it's a mechanism to move water for the state of California to agriculture primarily and domestic water users. So flows are a big thing, and fishing from the shore, wading, we need places to stand. So when the water is really high, that kind of limits our access. We can get around a lot, we can boat everywhere, but actually finding shorelines we can wade down, that becomes problematic. So we typically find that they start cutting back the irrigation water mid to late September, and then it'll roll down through the winter time, and it'll be maintained at a fairly low rate till right about now, mid-October is when they start.
It just started coming up.
The irrigation demand comes up, but like last year and this year, we've got heavy, precip, so Shasta has to dump some water to make room for incoming stream, for flood control. So sometimes we've gotten some big pulses that we don't necessarily want, but I would say pretty much from mid-September to mid-April are prime. If we're in, some drier years, and the allocations for the farmers down below aren't that great, they're not getting that much water, so the releases out of from Keswick are maybe 6,000-7,000 through the summertime. Then we can fish it with full confidence all summer long.
And it's good. Because I think the last few years it was like 4,500. CFS and all summer long caddis.
It can be fantastic. I unfortunately, I think for this season, we'll just have to watch the flows. They don't really tell us what the flows are going to be. But if it starts to where the releases, maintain 10,000 and above, then it really limits our access to the river.
Okay. So the main thing is mid-September to mid-April is prime time,
and I would say midwinter, December and January are probably the slowest months because the fish become a little more lethargic. But there are, again, going back, there are some steelhead, real legit steelhead in this river, and if you take on the mentality that we're out steelhead fishing and you get a grab and that's a great day, then we can have those great days in December, January, early February.
Gotcha.
Then like early February, the sun starts getting a little higher in the sky and bugs start popping and the fish start moving around.
Yes, awesome. I think I'm ready to go to TroutSpey.
Yeah.
Sounds awesome.
Well, if you are interested in learning more about TroutSpey or booking a guided trip, give us a ring. We'll get you hooked up with Randy or somebody else on our team who does TroutSpey. yeah, check us out. YouTube, Instagram,
Facebook,
TikTok,
MySpace.
TikTok.
Oh yeah, TikTok.
TikTok. Yep. And ConfluenceOutfitters.com. Call me on the toll-free number. I'll be the one who picks up the phone, and I will take care of you.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for listening.
Thank you.